What's up, guys? It's Paul from 1/6 Snail. Sweaty already because it is install day. We are going to be installing a couple of parts here. I'll show these to you. We're going to be installing the Turbosmart plumb back blow-off valve because I like the flutter a little bit better than the vent to atmosphere like straight whoosh noise. This will give you some of that like psh noise that's a little bit louder than the stock bypass valve, but it'll also give you some flutter, so I went with this option. And then while we're there, we might as well, right, we're going to do the Racer X turbo inlet. This does replace the stud on your turbo for your stock turbo inlet, but it does come with the socket that you need to take the stud off, and it replaces the 10 or 12 millimeter bolts that are on, I think they're 12 millimeter bolts that are on there with 5 millimeter hex heads, I believe, but I'll get you the exact hex when I get those on. This comes off with some T30 Torx bolts. There's 3 that are on it. When you put this back on, you really only need to torque them down to about 5 foot-pounds, you know, hand tight. And this also comes with Allen keys. I believe these are also the same 5 millimeters, but I'll let you know. So first steps first is you got to take the wheel off. So take the wheel off, jack it up. I got my car on jack stands here. I jack it up by the center bolt on the pitch mount, and then I use the Megan Racing race ramps. Then I jack it up with my extended low profile jack underneath the pitch mount. You'll see right there, I use a rubber, almost like bushing type of thing to jack this car up. I also put the rubber things on my jack stands, so that way I protect my pinch welds and it's not metal on metal. And then once you do that and get the wheel off, you are going to take this liner off. You're going to need to take that liner off, which is just some push clips you'll see there, some at the top, and then the under tray at the bottom has some push clips and some screws. I believe that they're 10 millimeter, and you can take the under tray off, or just as much as the under tray off as you need to get this piece out here, because we're going to need to get this off to get access to the turbo and the turbo inlet. I did these both at the same time because the bypass valve, in order to really get that off, you kind of need to take the turbo inlet off anyways. Makes it a lot easier. I highly suggest taking it off if you're going to do it. And there's a 10 millimeter right down there. You can see coming off the turbo inlet, there's that 10 millimeter hose clamp. And then you got your 2 12s, 1 nut and 1 bolt for the turbo inlet that come off. And then you can access your 3 T30 Torx bolts for your blow-off valve, and then you can unplug the blow-off valve, but you're kind of doing some of the blow-off valve blind because it's really hard to see the bolts. But so we're gonna get cracking on this. We're gonna start taking the wheel liner and the under tray off so we can gain some access, and I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so I just took out this liner right here. I did as much unclipping and unbolting underneath, just as much as I needed to get this out so I would have access in here. And as you can see, there is the turbo inlet right there, and then you have the bypass valve somewhere in there. I gotta shine a light and find that, and I'll show that to you. But we'll work on that turbo inlet and then seeing where we have access to the bypass valve. So what I'm doing is loosening up that clamp on the turbo inlet. It's a 10 millimeter. You can see my purple socket on it. Loosen that up. I'm cracking that loose first, and then I'm going to go underneath and do the 2 12 millimeter bolts. That should allow us to see the blow-off valve much better and gain access to those 3 Torque 30 bolts. Okay, so there's the 12 millimeter bolt and nut that come off of the turbo inlet. I will say the bottom one I use a swivel socket on an extension. The top one was, you kind of had to do by feel, but I used a shorter ratchet with the 12 millimeter on it. I was able to get it in there much easier. You can see right there that there's a stud with the nut on it, and then the bolt for the top. That stud you're going to replace for the Racer X turbo inlet, and like I said, they do give you the tool to get that stud out, the socket. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pull this off. And so there's the stud that comes out of the turbo. Time to take the turbo inlet and elbow off. Okay, so here's a comparison of the two inlets with the turbo inlet out. You can see that the inlet's the same size and all that. The stock one does have a orientation tab for the gasket if you are going to do a blow-off valve and need to reuse the turbo inlet. Just make sure that that's seated correctly. Clean it up the outside of the turbo if you want. But you can see that this tube, inner diameter and outer diameter, you can see that the Racer X is much beefier. It's going to stop that restriction. You are going to have two clamps. This clamp, top clamp, you do kind of have to do blind. From what I understand, it might be easier to have the clamps undone and then put them on once everything is seated in place. I'm going to try to put the clamps on and leave them loose like the directions say, so I can orient them correctly and then try to tighten them. I'll be back with my struggles with that. We're going to move on to the blow-off valve and see if we can get those 3 Torx bolts off now that we can see it. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, and with the turbo inlet out of the way, you can see that you have your stock blow-off valve bolts right there. You can see the orientation of the plug. The plug sits directly downward, so that's going to be the same way that you're going to install your aftermarket blow-off valve. So we're going to unplug that plug, and then we're going to get that wire out of the way, the one that's right there. And then we're going to do those 2 bolts, and the one on the other side that you can't see, you kind of have to do blind. So we're going to see how this goes. From what I understand, using a socket with a Torx 30 like drill bit kind of in the end may work the best for fitting it in this tight spot. We'll see how that works. If I need an extension or something, I'll let you know, guys know how I get those off. All right, so finally got it out. I am going to tell you that it sits like this. And this back one, you do have to do blind. It's not hard to, I mean, you kind of have to do them all blind, feel around. It takes a little bit. I'll say it's kind of a pain, but the easiest way that I was able to get to them was like this. So I just used a 1/4, a 1/4 socket, and that way I could use a drill bit. Torx 30. I have a Torx 30 like regular ratchet socket, but it's not thin and long enough to get to these bolts. If you don't have a setup like this, go get one or see if you can get a really like kind of a long, like maybe 1 inch or whatever, Torx 30. Space is tight. So a little ratchet like this with the T30 on the end, honestly, is going to be the best way to do it. They're not on there tight. It's like 5 foot-pounds of torque for these little screws. So that said, we'll do a comparison of this to the Turbosmart. Let me one-hand this. Okay. Sorry for the shaky camera. So, you'll see you got plenty of plug to run to your stock plug. And also, I don't know if this is going to help with the install, but this swivels so you can kind of line up the bolts. But you obviously want to have it in the same orientation that it went on. So it's going to be facing down like this, and this is going to kind of be facing like that, and you're going to use the supplied bolts. So let's get this bolted up and plugged in, and then we'll go back to installing the turbo inlet, and then we'll wrap it up and give it a start and see how she sounds. Okay, so got all the 5mm bolts in. It helps to use 2 hands. Luckily I have small hands, so I can go from both sides of this piece right here, back behind here, and one hand here, and you can kind of hold it up with one hand and screw in your first screw. Once you get your first screw in, that back one that you can kind of barely see back there, that one's kind of a pain, but honestly getting the bolts on with it being a 5mm hex key, because the hex keys are long, at least mine are, it does make it easier to get the bolts on and tightened. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the Racer X Turbo inlet. That's anywhere from 7 to 10 pounds-foot of torque. You know, hand tight, not overly tight. This does go into the turbo, so you don't want to over torque these. But that's kind of a general rule of thumb, 7 to 10 foot-pounds, which is probably 1.5 ooga-doogas, right? So let's get that inlet mounted, the clamps on and everything, and we'll put that back up into the turbo inlet tube up there. And we'll slap all this plastics and the wheels back on, and I'll show you the installed turbo inlet. Okay, so it's a 7mm for the hose clamps for the Racer X Turbo inlet clamps, and then the 2 bolts that are going to go onto the turbo for the inlet are 6mm hex keys. So let's get this all lined up. I'll let you know if having these on like this or having them off and then putting them on is easier. I know this top one you kind of just have to do by feel. This bottom one obviously you'll be able to see. So this is how they tell you to do it in the instructions. We'll see if this is the easiest way. Alright, as you can see, we have the turbo inlet on itself. I was trying to put it with the coupler on, but actually you can't, because you can't get those screws on for the turbo inlet with the tube on. So now that that's on, we're going to put the inlet on, and then we'll snug it down with the worm clamps, and I'll show you what that looks like. So a couple of things with the Racer X inlet, turbo inlet, and the Turbosmart blow-off valve install. One thing that I found that was a little bit of a pain for the blow-off valve was just that it's good and bad, right? Like, the bracket that it comes with to hold on the blow-off valve spins, and it spins so that way you can get, you know, the orientation of the bolts, because they're kind of hard to reach if you don't have small dainty hands like me. But the issue is that there's 2 flat slots on the blow-off valve itself that allow that bracket to slide on and off. So the first time I put it on, I had 1 bolt just in there, so that way I could try to put it on and start to hand thread it in there. And it fell off with the bolt in it, and I had to find it in the under tray and all that stuff. So that was kind of a pain. But once I got the bottom one started, it stayed good. And what I did realize is it is slightly bigger than the stock blow-off valve. So when I went to go do the turbo inlet, the 90-degree elbow didn't have as much clearance in between the inlet and the blow-off valve itself. That made it kind of a pain to get the turbo inlet on, because the clearance is not as wide. So that was kind of a pain. But what you can do is just loosen up the 3 bolts on the blow-off valve enough so you can turn the blow-off valve to, you know, counterclockwise to the left, so you can turn the plug up a little bit higher and out of the way of the turbo inlet. The other thing is, with the turbo inlet itself, the 90-degree elbow, I'm not going to say was fun to put on. It's an easy, like, simple process. The replacement of this isn't really that difficult. As far as like what you have to do, it's not. It's just a tight space and hard to work in that tight space, especially if you have bigger hands. If you have bigger hands, this is going to be a little bit difficult, but there is space enough to work. You just, again, look at the tools that I use to make it a little bit easier. As far as for putting the 90-degree elbow on the Racer X Turbo inlet, what I did was lay straight across the bottom of the front bumper, like parallel with it. And when you do that, you can get your arms around like the bracing arms underneath the car, and that allows you to use 2 hands, and you kind of have to fold the turbo inlet on itself in order for it to seat on the inlet and on the inlet pipe that goes straight up. I tried it a couple of different ways. I tried to put it on the inlet first, because my issue was where I had that small gap, that tight space in between where the inlet elbow needed to go and the blow-off valve, I'd get it on the inlet, and then I would try to rotate it so I could get it onto the straight inlet pipe, and it kept popping off the top of the turbo inlet. So the best thing to do is to lay down, put both hands through, have it facing where it needs to face to go on the inlet and on the pipe, and I put it all the way on the inlet, and then I bent the top towards me to get it around the top pipe. But as you're doing that, you have to like hold it against the front of the turbo inlet so it stays flush, so it doesn't pop off the top there. And then, you know, then I was able to get it seated on the turbo inlet pipe that goes straight. I was trying to put it on the straight part of the turbo inlet first and then rotate it to get it on the turbo inlet, but I just couldn't get the top to seat right on the turbo inlet. So that was the only way I was really able to do it. You kind of have to play with it a bit and do some twisting and some bending of it. But it is doable. It's a pain, kind of, but it's doable. Knowing how to do that now, I think it would have taken me a lot less time. So hopefully this video helps you guys if you're putting that on. I mean, if you're replacing it with either the Eventuri turbo inlet that we have, that's carbon fiber and it's behind the motor, and it's a nice piece, don't get me wrong. Eventuri is great stuff, but it's, I don't know if it's worth the price versus just doing like the Racer X turbo inlet. You can buy it all from 1/6 nail and decide what you like the best, but I think for the price of the Eventuri with the gains that you get versus the turbo inlet from Racer X, I don't know, personal preference. Eventuri one's carbon fiber, it looks cool, but you don't really see it because the cowl covers it, and I feel like you'd scratch the shit out of that turbo inlet pipe in the back putting that in. Maybe not, maybe it looks cool, you let me know. But anyways, that's my takeaways for the turbo inlet and the blow-off valve, and just the kind of little challenges and the little nuances that I ran into on the install. But aside from that, we'll head over to the review of the items. I will say that the turbo inlet definitely did give me some faster spooling with the turbo, so a little bit better throttle response, and I'm definitely hit boost a little bit quicker, and it definitely seems to pull a little bit harder than what it did before. So for the cost and the little bit of aggravation to get the parts installed, I think it's a good gain. So we'll go over to the overview of the post install now. Thank you guys for watching. One thing I did forget to mention on the Racer X turbo inlet is I did undo the worm clamps all the way, and I put the inlet on without the clamps, and then I put the clamps on after. The clamps are definitely getting in the way of me being able to twist and orient the 90-degree elbow the way that I needed to. So I did take them off and then open them up, obviously, so I can get them on once the inlet's on. The bottom one isn't that bad. You can see both of them, really. The bottom one wasn't that bad because you're laying on the ground and stuff like that. The top one was kind of a pain because you do really want to hold it up at the top, and you kind of have to, obviously, like squeezing the worm clamp together with one hand, and then you want to start to hand tighten the clamp with your other hand. And once you start to get it to, you know, tighten a little bit, then you can start to use your ratchet and tighten it. The top one was kind of a pain because you kind of have to hold it at an angle to be able to do that. Once you get it started, and then you're just holding it where you want it to sit, is, you know, not really that bad. Give me a second, I'll show you kind of what the top one looks like, so that way you can kind of see how it sits or how I have mine. But, you know, it kind of took me a little bit to get the top one. Like I said, the bottom one wasn't that bad, but definitely doable with some swearing and a couple of scratches on your hands. Okay, so there you can see the turbo inlet seated right there with the worm clamp. You can kind of see how it bends over to the turbo inlet down there. Like I said, a little bit of a pain. You can actually see the blow-off valve a little bit better now. A little bit of a pain, a little tight right there. In this corner, let me see if I can put my hand down there. I just drove the car to make sure that everything was buttoned up and looked good, so it's going to kind of be hot, but right there where the 90-degree elbow is kind of close to the blow-off valve, that's where it was a little tight and trying to twist this thing and get it on and stuff, but obviously doable. I did it. it's definitely upgrades that are worth it. So that's kind of what it looks like. That top clamp was just hard to put on while squeezing it with one hand and hand tightening it. But once I got it started, it was good. I know it was probably hard to hear the blow-off valve with my window down and my loud-ass exhaust. I thought it would have been a little bit better to hear with the window down, but obviously the air noise. But I'll say volume-wise, the air burst, if you will, is a little bit... It's probably about the same as the stock blow-off valve. It is a little bit loud. It's louder than the stock one the harder you are on the throttle. And with the inlet does make the turbo spool faster and pull slightly harder. So for those reasons alone, I think it's good. And when you're a little bit heavier on the throttle, I will say that the plumb back valve is louder than the stock one, both in like the initial air surge, but it also flutters. Like I said, I mean, the stock one kind of fluttered a little bit too, but I will say it's louder than the stock one if you're heavier on the pedal. Lighter on the pedal, I'll say this, it's probably about the same as the stock one. But, you know, we also have the vent to atmosphere one, which is obviously going to be louder. I just didn't want to take the chance of throwing a CEL or whatever with the tune that I have. I don't think it would have been a big deal. They're all supposed to be plug and play. If any of you guys order the vent to atmosphere one and you don't get a CEL or do, definitely leave a comment. Let us know. We'd like to get feedback from that stuff. So, thank you guys for watching the video. You know the deal. Drive fast, take chances. 16nail.com.